About 3 years ago, around Christmas time, I was having a coffee with Nick Zeppos, who's the chancellor at Vanderbilt. And Nick has been a friend, somebody that I respect and have learned quite a bit from. But if you went to Vanderbilt, or if you've been to a graduation at Vanderbilt, then you know that the chancellor gives the commencement address every year. They don't bring in a different person or a guest speaker. So Nick Zeppos gives the commencement address year after year. So one of the questions that I had for him is, how do you come up with the material year after year to incite young minds as they prepare to be launched into the real world? And he referred to a book by an author that I was very familiar with, a guy by the name of Jonathan Haidt. And I had read Haidt's book called The Righteous Mind, but I had not read the book that he recommended to me called The Happiness Hypothesis. So he told me about the book, and he actually sent me a copy of it, and it's a fascinating book. In the book, Jonathan Haidt explores three basic theories of happiness. The first theory of happiness, he says, is that happiness comes from getting and achieving what you want. It comes from buying new things and achieving success and getting a promotion, being upwardly mobile, chasing the American dream. But Haidt says that research has confirmed that the problem with this is that it's always short-lived. It doesn't have staying power. It gives you happiness or meaning for a little while, but it doesn't last. So the second theory that Haidt looks at in the book is the concept that happiness comes from within. It has to start within, and it cannot be dependent upon external circumstances or other people. It's a decision that you have to make, and it starts from within. This is kind of the Buddhist approach to happiness. But the problem with that is that we are social creatures, and we cannot just isolate ourselves from external relationships and from outside factors. So the third theory that Haidt gives, and the one that he develops in the book, is that happiness comes from between. It comes from between. It comes from getting our relationships right, starting with our spouse, our family, our friends. This theory explains why people who are constantly embroiled in conflict are the least happy. We find our meaning from interacting with each other. And even though people don't always get along, we are much more at peace and fulfilled in life when our relationships are in a good place. He says, conflicts in relationships, having an annoying office mate or a roommate, or having chronic conflict with your spouse, is one of the surest ways to reduce your happiness. You never adapt to interpersonal conflict. It damages every day, even days when you don't see the other person, but ruminate about the conflict nonetheless. He says happiness is not something that you can find, acquire, or achieve directly. You have to get the conditions right and then wait. Some of those conditions are within you, such as coherence among the parts and levels of your personality, but other conditions require relationships to things beyond you. Just like a plant needs sun and water and good soil to thrive, people need love and work and connection to something larger. It's worth striving to get the relationships between yourself and others, between yourself and your work colleagues, between yourself and something that's larger than yourself. Because if you can get the relationships right, he says, then a sense of purpose and meaning will emerge. Now, what drove him into this moral psychology field, and what made him write this book, is he was exploring the question, why do some people live lives that are full of zest and commitment and meaning and purpose, but other people feel like their lives are empty and meaningless and pointless? And he raises that question. And it's a good question. It's a question that we should all wrestle with. We're now in our stewardship campaign that we do every year in April, about this time after Easter. And it's a time when we are reminded that everything that we do here at Woodmont, everything from outreach to children's ministry to youth ministry to sustaining this beautiful building and grounds, that it's up to all of us to make this happen. It doesn't just happen on its own. And so we are reminded that we're called to be generous. And next Sunday is Commitment Sunday, where we're called to make a commitment to support the mission and ministries of the church for another year. But as it relates to Haidt's theory of happiness and meaning, coming from between, the church is a place where community happens. And even though the church is not perfect, and it's never been perfect, and it never will be perfect, this is a place where we come together to worship and to love and to serve and to grow and to educate. It's a place where we lift each other up, we celebrate the joys and the sorrows of life, and we do it together in community because happiness and meaning comes from between. We achieve it together. When I was doing my work at Sewanee, my interest was in faith and politics and where the two intersect. But the professors down there really wanted me to pick a specific topic because they said that topic is too broad. It covers too much ground. So they said, we want you to focus on something like war or the death penalty or health care. But ultimately, I decided to pick the topic of money and materialism as it relates to the spiritual life. Because money's related to politics, but money's also a universal topic that every single one of us has to deal with. It doesn't matter if we have a little bit. It doesn't matter if we have a lot. It's something that's universal. It's something that causes a lot of stress and heartache and pain in life, and we have to deal with it. And there's something else. Jesus had a lot to say about it. And if we are called to be his disciples, called to be his followers, then we have to take those words seriously and we have to wrestle with them. So what did he have to say? Here's a couple things. Let's start with the Sermon on the Mount, the reading this morning. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust consume and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moth and rust do not consume and where thieves do not break in and steal. Now, the truth is, we all store up treasures on earth. It's a part of living in this world. It's a part of playing the game. We have to have a place to live. We have to have a car to drive. We have to have clothes to wear. But what does it mean to store up treasures in heaven? How do we do that? Jesus says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. He didn't say where your heart is, there your treasure will be also. He said, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Heart follows treasure. Treasure does not always follow heart. That's a timeless truth. Later in Matthew's gospel, Jesus has an encounter with a rich man. He asked Jesus, Teacher, what good deed must I do to have eternal life? And he says, why do you ask me about what is good? There's only one who is good. If you wish to enter into life, then keep the commandments. He said, which ones? You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. Honor your father and mother. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And the young man said, I've kept all of these since my youth. What do I lack? And Jesus says, okay. If you want to be perfect, then go and sell all of your possessions and give the money to the poor, and then you'll have treasure in heaven, and come and follow me. And when the young man heard this, he went away grieving because he had many possessions. He was sad. And Jesus says to his disciples, truly I tell you, it will be hard for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. And when the disciples heard this, they were greatly astounded. They were disturbed. They said, well, then who can be saved? And Jesus said, well, for mortals it's impossible, but not for God. With God all things are possible. Do we have to sell everything that we own in order to follow Jesus? No, and we don't. But in the case of the rich man, there was no way that he was ever going to get it, because he was defined by being rich. Sometimes it takes a radical break from our stuff in life to really understand what Jesus is talking about. Sometimes we get so enmeshed in the things of this world that we can't grasp the concept of the kingdom of God. In Luke's gospel, we have a parable. The parable of the rich fool. The man whose crops produced abundantly tears down his barns. He builds larger ones. And then he says, soul, you can now relax and eat and drink and be merry. But if you recall, Jesus calls him a fool. He says, take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. But that's not what our culture says. We're told that our life does consist in the abundance of possessions. And that's why we tend to measure the value of a person based on what they have. There is a shallowness that's present in a culture that is obsessed with materialism. We don't get to know people for who they are. We only get to know them for what they have. And this is not where meaning is found. This is not where deep friendship is found. These are all challenging texts. And there are many more. These are the words of Jesus that challenge conventional wisdom, that makes Christianity countercultural, and that leaves us squirming in our seat. But we have to wrestle with it. I want to leave you this morning with a few thoughts. Some of these thoughts I develop in the book, Preaching Politics. But I want to leave you with these thoughts, and I want you to wrestle with them as you go forth this morning. The first thought is this. We have to push back against the shallowness of a materialistic culture. There's nothing wrong with being successful. There's nothing wrong with owning nice things. But we can't let the superficial things of life define who we are and how we relate to each other. Eugene Peterson, a Presbyterian pastor, once said, I love being an American. I love this place in which I have been placed, its language, its history, its energy. But I don't love the American way, its culture and its values. I don't love the rampant consumerism that treats God as a product to be marketed. I don't love the dehumanizing ways that turn men, women, and children into impersonal roles and causes and statistics. I don't love the competitive spirit that treats others as rivals and even as enemies. In a consumer culture, everything gets reduced to being a commodity. We tend to love things and use people rather than loving people and using things. We have to do everything in our power, I believe, to get beneath the surface, to not be superficial, and to get to know people for who they really are and not just for what they have. It's your character, and it's compassion, and it's kindness. It's not just what you own. My dad quoted Winston Churchill last Sunday, who once made the statement that you make a living by what you get, but you make a life by what you give. It's what we give in life that matters, not just what we have. There is a shallowness in our culture that needs to be called out because it keeps us from connecting on a deeper level. Second thought, we have to understand and wrestle with the question, where does meaning come from? One of the problems in our culture is that people are looking for meaning in all the wrong places, and they often confuse happiness with meaning. There was an article in The Atlantic that I've quoted before, written by Emily Smith, and it was titled, There's More to Life Than Being Happy. And she refers to Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl, who wrote that famous book, Man's Search for Meaning. Have you ever read that book? And she talks about the difference between meaning and happiness. Happiness without meaning characterizes a relatively shallow, self-absorbed, or even selfish life in which things go well, needs and desires are easily satisfied, and difficult or taxing estrangements are avoided. Having an abundance of money might bring about temporary happiness, but in and of itself, it will not provide meaning in life. Happiness comes and goes, but meaning has longevity and staying power. People whose lives have high levels of meaning actively seek the things that bring about meaning, even if it comes at the expense of happiness. So things like sacrifice and friendship and keeping a marriage alive and raising children, sustaining a career, these things don't always make you happy, but they do give you meaning. She says that happiness is associated with taking, but meaning is associated with giving. Happiness is fleeting, but meaning has longevity. Happiness results from a lot of things that are out of our control, but meaning is something that we choose and we have to work for in life. Every single one of us wants to be happy, but much more than that, we long for meaning and for purpose. Viktor Frankl once said, being human always points and is directed to something or someone other than oneself. The more one forgets himself by giving himself a cause to serve or another person to love, the more human that person becomes. My final thought this morning is that Jesus makes it clear to us in the Scriptures that the way that we use our time and our money is the true test of what's really important to us in life. You know, calendars and bank statements have never lied. They're moral documents. You can communicate to somebody what is the most important thing in your life by the way that you spend your time and your money. If you were to make a list of your priorities in life, the things that you think are most important, you might be surprised that your time and your money don't line up with that. And whether we want to admit it or not, we send a message to ourselves and to other people by the way that we spend our time and our money. So, for example, we might say that being with our children is a top priority, but then we're guilty of working late and bringing work home and not being present when we're with them. We might say that keeping our marriage alive and healthy is really important, but we never schedule a date night or a weekend away with our spouse. We might say that the church is a top priority, but we don't give much to the church and we don't show up very often, but it's still really important to us. We might say that the National Food Project is a phenomenal outreach ministry, but we don't volunteer for it and we don't go out on the trucks and we don't cook for it. We might say that family is important, but we can't remember the last time that we called to check on our aging mother or father or our sibling that lives in another state. We might say that being a good parent is a top priority, but when was the last time that we read a parenting book or went to a class to try to work on those skills? We could say that homelessness and poverty is terrible and it's a huge challenge in our culture, but we've never volunteered for room in the inn or signed up to go and build a Habitat house. The way we spend our time and our money sends a message as to what is most important in our lives. Jesus says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. All of us long for meaning and purpose in life. We long for connection and community. We long to make a difference and to impact other people. And if what Jonathan Haidt says is right, that happiness comes from between, and I think he's right, then it comes from serving and sacrificing and giving and living together in community, so we don't have to face life alone. Because life is hard, and it beats us up, and it wears us out, and it hits us with things that we never see coming. We have to support each other and love each other and lift each other up. I hope you'll consider supporting Woodmont for another year next week on Commitment Sunday. But more importantly than that, I hope you will ask the question, where does meaning come in my life? And how am I working to have more meaning? And let's remember why we have the church in the first place. Amen.